We're going to delve into the dark and often overlooked history of Scotland's criminal underworld. But before we dive into the seedy world of organized crime, let's set the stage with a little bit of context. In the early 20th century, Scotland was a hotbed of industrialization and urbanization. As people flocked to the cities in search of work, they also brought with them a host of social problems, including poverty, unemployment, and a lack of affordable housing. It was in this environment that Scotland's first gangs began to take root. These early gangs were primarily made up of working-class youth who had been marginalized by society. With few job prospects and a lack of social support, they turned to crime as a means of survival. The first of these gangs was the notorious Titty Boys, named after the fashionable Edwardian-style suits that they wore. The Titty Boys were known for their love of violence and their penchant for clashes with the police. They were also heavily involved in the black market and were known to engage in petty theft and robbery. As the decades passed, the Titty Boys were joined by a host of other gangs, each with their own unique style and MO. There were the Neds, who were known for their rough and rowdy behavior, and the Bam Bams, who were notorious for their involvement in the drug trade. But perhaps the most infamous of all was the Glasgow Razor gangs. These brutal mobs were known for their ruthless violence and their use of the cutthroat razor as a weapon of choice. The razor gangs were deeply entrenched in the city's criminal underworld and were involved in everything from extortion to murder. As the years went on, Scotland's gangs only continued to grow in power and influence. They were fueled by the social and economic issues that plagued the country, as well as the proliferation of drugs and the rise of organized crime. But it wasn't all bad news. In the face of this criminal threat, ordinary people began to fight back. Community groups and law enforcement agencies worked together to combat the gangs and bring them to justice. And gradually, the tide began to turn. In the 1980s and 1990s, a series of successful police crackdowns and social initiatives helped to significantly reduce the power and influence of Scotland's gangs. Today, while they still exist, they are nowhere near as prevalent as they once were. In recent years, there has been a resurgence of gang activity in the country, particularly in the major cities. One of the primary drivers of this resurgence has been the proliferation of drugs. Scotland has a long history of drug abuse, but in recent years, the problem has only gotten worse. The country has some of the highest rates of drug-related deaths in Europe, with many of these deaths being linked to organized crime. Gangs have played a significant role in this drug epidemic. They have been responsible for the distribution and sale of illicit substances, often using violence and intimidation to protect their territory. And as the drug trade has grown, so too have the gangs themselves. But it's not just drugs that have fueled the rise of Scotland's gangs. The country's economic struggles have also played a role. With high unemployment and a lack of job opportunities, many young people have turned to crime as a means of making a living. This has led to the formation of new gangs, as well as the expansion of existing ones. The rise of Scotland's gangs has had a significant impact on the country. Gang violence has led to an increase in gun crime, while the drug trade has contributed to a rise in drug-related deaths and addiction. It has also had a negative impact on the country's economy, as businesses and tourists are often hesitant to visit areas with high levels of gang activity. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are signs that the tide may be turning once again. In recent years, law enforcement agencies have stepped up their efforts to combat gang activity, with a number of successful operations being carried out. And there are also a number of initiatives in place to try and prevent young people from joining gangs in the first place. One such initiative is the No Knives, Better Lives campaign, which aims to reduce knife crime and educate young people about the dangers of carrying a weapon. There are also programs in place to provide support and guidance to those who are at risk of joining a gang, helping to steer them away from a life of crime. Despite these efforts, it's clear that Scotland's gang problem is far from solved. But with the right approach and a little bit of luck, it's possible that the country can once again reclaim its streets from the clutches of organized crime. While Scotland's gang problem is not as widespread as it once was, there are still a number of different gangs operating in the country today. These include the Neds. The Neds, also known as non-educated delinquents, are a type of street gang that originated in Glasgow in the 1980s. They are often associated with violence and are known for their rough and rowdy behavior. The Bam Bams. The Bam Bams are a Glasgow-based gang that is heavily involved in the drug trade. They are known for their involvement in the distribution and sale of illicit substances, particularly heroin. The Glasgow Razor Gangs. As mentioned earlier, the Glasgow Razor Gangs were a group of brutal mobs that were active in the city during the 1920s and 1930s. They were known for their ruthless violence and their use of the cutthroat razor as a weapon. The Teddy Boys. The Teddy Boys were the first of Scotland's gangs, taking root in the early 20th century. They were known for their love of violence and their involvement in the black market. The Glasgow Crime Family. The Glasgow Crime Family is a powerful organized crime group that has been operating in the city for decades. They are involved in a range of illegal activities, including drug trafficking and extortion. These are just a few examples of the many different gangs that have operated in Scotland over the years. While they may vary in size and scope, they all pose a threat to public safety and the well-being of communities. But the story of Scotland's gangs doesn't end with law enforcement efforts and prevention initiatives. There are also a number of grassroots organizations working to combat gang violence and support those affected by it. One such organization is the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, SVRU. Founded in 2005, the SVRU is a partnership between the police, the NHS, and various other agencies. Its goal is to reduce violent crime and its causes, with a particular focus on knife crime and gang violence. The SVRU takes a unique approach to tackling these issues, focusing on harm reduction rather than just punishment. This means that rather than simply arresting and prosecuting offenders, the SVRU works to understand the root causes of violent behavior and provide support to those at risk of committing crimes. This includes programs like the Cashback for Creativity initiative, which provides funding for young people to participate in creative activities as an alternative to gangs. The SVRU also works with schools and community groups to provide education and support to young people at risk of involvement in gang activity. The SVRU's approach has been largely successful, with a number of studies showing that it has had a significant impact on reducing violent crime in Scotland. But the SVRU is just one example of the many organizations working to combat gang violence in Scotland. There are also a number of charities and community groups that provide support to those affected by gang violence, including those who have lost loved ones to gang-related incidents. One such group is the Glasgow Families Against Gangs and Violence Group, which provides support and guidance to families affected by gang violence. The group works to raise awareness of the issues surrounding gang violence and provide a supportive community for those affected by it. While the work of these organizations is crucial, it's important to remember that they are only part of the solution. Tackling gang violence requires a multifaceted approach, including strong law enforcement efforts, prevention initiatives, and support for those affected by it. So there you have it, a look at some of the organizations working to combat gang violence in Scotland. It's a complex and ongoing problem, but with the right approach and a little bit of luck, it's possible to make a real difference. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the world of Scotland's gangs. Until next time.